I'm currently in North Carolina at Carolina Beach, and I'm shooting with the Sony A7IV, but I've got a special lens on it. It's a vintage Canon FD 28mm f2.8 lens. I'm going to walk around, shoot some photos, and explain to you what it's like using vintage glass on a modern mirrorless camera. So let's go shoot some photos. So if you're new to shooting vintage glass, I think there's a couple reasons why someone would want to shoot vintage glass, and we'll get into that in a second. I've got a cool looking house here. I wish the sky had a little more, range to it. It's pretty gray and bland, but we'll see what we get. So the first reason people tend to shoot with vintage glass is because it's softer than modern day lenses. Modern mirrorless lenses are so sharp, everything looks tack sharp, everything's in focus, and it kind of lacks character that the vintage glass of the film days used to have. And when you shoot with vintage glass, you bring that vintage look and that character and softness to modern day technology, and it's a really unique experience. I really like the symmetry this stairway has, and because I'm using this 28mm lens, I can get the whole building in the shot without cutting everything off, which is not what I'm used to because I usually use a 35. I just wish we had a bit more sun. It's pretty gray and gloomy today, just isn't what you always want on a beach. The second reason people like to use vintage glass is it's a slower shooting experience. It's the same reason why people like to shoot on film still. It slows you down. And using a manual vintage lens on a modern day camera slows you down. Everything from focusing to changing exposure just takes more thought and time. We'll get into that a bit more as I walk through how this has changed my shooting experience later on in the video. There's an old diner right here. It looks like it's been around as long as the lens I'm shooting with, so it should fit perfectly to go. On an unrelated note, I've been using my Osmo Pocket 3 to film all this, and I dropped it, it landed somewhere over here, and the ND filter fell off. I am never going to be able to find that, so I guess I'm ordering a new ND filter. So if everything's bright in the rest of this video, now you know why. The last reason I think someone wants to use vintage glass like this FD lens is price. You can get vintage glass fairly cheap. Sites like Canon have tons of options, or you can go to garage sales and flea markets and you never know what you'll find. So let's talk about how you use vintage glass with mirrorless cameras. All right, I'm back at the Airbnb now. I apologize if there's an echo and if the lighting isn't great. As I said, I'm at an Airbnb, I'm not in my studio, so there's a lot of stuff I can't control. To be honest, when I was out shooting, I wasn't really enjoying the photos I was taking. It had nothing to do with the lens, but more the lighting. As you can see, it's super gray and gross out. And when I'm at a beach, I'm looking for sunny photos, and I just wasn't getting that, so I wasn't super happy. So I figured I'd come back here, I'd talk to you about how to adapt vintage glass to mirrorless cameras, and then I'll go out another day and shoot some bright, sunny photos. Hopefully. To adapt vintage glass to a mirrorless camera, it's really simple. All you need is one adapter. I have an FD to Sony E-mount adapter. Now, depending on what vintage glass you're using and what mirrorless camera you're using, you may need something different. I got my adapter from Canon Concepts. I've gotten a ton of stuff from them, and they make really great products. They have a ton of different adapters, so if you're looking to adapt vintage glass to your mirrorless camera, I suggest checking them out. Now, mounting your lens to the adapter is really simple. It's the same way you'd mount a lens to a camera. You just lock it in and twist, and you're good to go. Then you mount that adapter into your mirrorless camera just like you would any other lens, and you're set. Now this is a fully manual experience. So what that means is on your EVF, you won't be able to see your aperture, so you won't know what number you're on unless you're looking at the lens, and you'll have to change it with the lens. You can't change it with your physical buttons on the back. And you won't be able to focus with autofocus. All your focusing is going to be manual, which makes sense. It's a fully manual experience. So let's hope for a sunnier day and talk about the shooting experience when we have some better lighting. I'll put money on it that the wave crashes on my foot. Whenever I'm at the ocean and I have shoes on, my shoes end up soaked. All right, it's the next day, and as you can tell, it's much sunnier out. It's a nicer day. It's a little windy, so I hope that doesn't come up on the audio. But overall, I'm just more confident in the lighting and the shots I'm gonna get because of it. That being said, the shots I got from this past day's shooting that I didn't think were gonna be great actually turned out good. And I was surprised, and I really liked the images I was getting with this vintage lens. So let's talk about the shooting experience. First off, focusing is completely different than what you're used to when you're using a modern day lens. So like I said, the overall focusing experience is just different. I find myself using the EVF a lot more than I would if I was using modern glass. Normally I don't use the EVF a lot, but I'm finding it's been super helpful to make sure I nail focus. I also find it's just a slower process. I'm making sure my focus is tack sharp, because when I do miss focus, unlike with modern glass, when you miss focus with vintage glass, it looks much softer. Because getting sharp photos with this vintage glass can be so tough, I use two in-camera features to help make sure I nail focus. The first is focus peaking. This highlights whatever's in focus in a certain color specified in your camera. Mine's set to red, so I know anything that's highlighted in red is in focus. But I find this isn't quite enough. So I use the magnify feature. I have it set to a custom button so I can punch in and make sure my photos are sharp and in focus before I take them. This is why using the EVF has been super helpful, just because you get a little more resolution to make sure everything is tack sharp. I also do some things different with my exposure to make sure that everything is sharp with this lens. Now when it comes to my exposure, I tend to like to shoot at the lower end of my f-stop. I try to keep my lens wide open. So on this lens it would mean f2.8, but I'm finding I'm much happier shooting this lens at f5.6 to f8. This is keeping my images sharper, where if I'm at f2.8, it's much harder to get focus and the image gets a lot softer, where on modern glass at f2.8, your image is still pretty sharp. Now you can shoot at f2.8, and as you see in some night shots, I have shot at f2.8 and it works well, but it's just softer than a normal lens or a more modern lens would be at f2.8, so my aperture tends to be higher, and that means I have a lower shutter speed and my ISO may come up a bit more. So overall, my exposure and how I set my exposure is a bit different when using vintage glass, just like this FD lens. Now, shooting with vintage glass isn't for everyone. For me, I think it helps me slow down and it improves my photography because it slows me down. Think more about your composition, your focus, your exposure. Everything's just a slower process, and that means you take less photos, but you get more keepers. I think everyone should try shooting with vintage glass. The lenses are cheap, the adapters are cheap. There's no reason not to pick one up and give it a shot. For now, go out, take some photos. Thanks for watching.